Hey, Driven Youth, this is the 36th installment of the Exile Challenge, and we are in Ezra chapter 4. I encourage you to go back and read Ezra chapter 4. Well, when we're reading through the Old Testament, sometimes it can be challenging to try to determine, okay, what is the application that I can draw from this? Okay, so it's difficult. So we just got to remember when we're reading the Old Testament, and really anywhere in the Bible, we have to try to determine, one, okay, what is it saying? What is there? And so we're making our observations and trying to determine what is being said through the biblical writer, through the work of the Holy Spirit, what's being said. We also want to see, okay, what is being communicated or commanded to the people of that time. Okay, and then thirdly, then we can try to bridge the gap, bridge the cultural barriers that are there, and maybe some distinctions. And okay, then how do we then apply this to our lives? And so, for instance, we see some differences here in this passage. We live under the new covenant. These people were under the old covenant. They were building a temple. We no longer have to build a temple, nor do we go to a temple for worship. We no longer have. They were burning, offering sacrifices, and on the altar as a burnt sacrifice. We no longer have to make these animal sacrifices. But there are some connections, right? So we are now, as described, the church is the temple of God, being built together, okay? We don't offer physical sacrifices, but we offer spiritual sacrifices. Romans chapter 12, verse 1 would be one example. He says, beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable unto God, which is a reasonable act of service. So that's just one example. There's several other passages that talk about spiritual sacrifices to the Lord and just living in obedience to the Lord. So can we make those kind of connections? Is it okay to say, well, they're building the temple, so maybe the encouragement to us is that we need to continue building God's temple, the church, by edifying others, by being kind to one another, tenderhearted, forgiving one another, even God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven you. That's a possibility. I'm not sure that. I think we should be cautious in making those kinds of connections, because that's not what's being communicated. But I could see, you think about it. I'm not sure that I would necessarily. I'm not sure that's what the passage is talking about, right? I'm not sure that's what the passage is talking about. So what is the passage talking about? Well, let's get into it. Before we get into that, what I want to do is I want to do kind of a chronology of the kings of Persia, because within this passage, it's hotly debated that the author is not accurate to history. And if you read it and you know the chronology of the kings of Persia, I can see where you would get that. But we need to realize what's going on here, and I think that there's a good answer and response of why that's not the case, why he has it right. So let's just kind of take a look at this real quick. In verse 5, well, just before we get there, you've already read the passage, you know what's going on. We got people of the land that heard the commotion. You know, in chapter 3, at the end of chapter 3, it says that they were shouting so loud that the people could hear all around this commotion. So they heard what was going on and eventually went over there and to try to see what was happening. And so they go over and they say, hey, we want to help you guys. You know, we've been worshiping your God for so long, blah, 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 all these things, lies. And Zerubbabel sees past their deception and says, no, you have nothing to do with us. We're building it. King Cyrus gave the command. We're building it for the Lord. And King Cyrus gave us the command, so you have nothing to do with us when it comes to this. And so from that point on, it's just absolute opposition from those people, the people of the land. And then in verse 5, it says, and they also bribed counselors against them to frustrate their purposes. So they hired people. They hired people from probably Persian authorities to some extent to go and frustrate the building of this temple. Whatever they did, I don't know. Maybe they were just hired henchmen, and they went and said that they were going to kill you if you kept building this thing. Anyways, so this frustration went on from the days of King Cyrus of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. Okay, so right now I'm going to plop up a little picture of the chronology of the kings of Persia and their dates there. All right, so from King Cyrus, which was around 539 BC, when they conquered Babylon. 539 BC all the way to the reign of King Darius, which is about 522 BC. So you got that time period right there. I want you to know that the temple was built, the scholars believe that it was built around 515 BC. Okay, so during the reign of King Darius, it was just mentioned in verse 5. All right, so but then we get to verse 6, and it says, "And in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, they wrote an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem." So these people who came to him and said, "Hey, we want to help you out. We love you guys," continue to show their absolute deception and lies and opposition and hatred for God's people and God's purposes and God's plans, God's work. And they write accusations, so they go to the court of law, which was King Ahasuerus. You remember who King Ahasuerus was? We read about him in Esther. He was the king of Esther. And so he ruled around 486 to 465 BC. Okay, I think that's stated there in the chronology. So it's somewhere around there, 486 to 465 BC. So they write these accusations. Then in the next sentence, verse 7, it says, "In the days of Artaxerxes." This was the king after King Ahasuerus. And he reigned from 465 to about 424, 425 BC. This king, in his reign, this was during the time that Ezra finally came to Jerusalem, and this was also the time that Nehemiah came to Jerusalem in order to build the walls. Ezra came to Jerusalem in about 458 BC, and Nehemiah came to Jerusalem in 445 BC in order to build the walls around Jerusalem. And so this is King Artaxerxes. And so now it talks about them writing a letter to King Artaxerxes about all the issues that they're dealing with these Jewish people, this opposition. Now they're writing this letter to King Artaxerxes, okay? So they write the letter. You can read it. This is what they said. It's all inflammatory language that's being used. And so that's how they write to the king. They're trying to overstate their case here. And then the king replies back to them. King Artaxerxes replies back to him and says, "Hey, you need to stop them." And so they go and they stop them by force. And then we get to verse 24. So we're in King Artaxerxes' land, which was, remember, it's the time of 465 to 424, somewhere around in there. Probably, I want to say this, probably this letter was written before Nehemiah. Even though it talks about walls being built, I don't think that's a reference to Nehemiah. I think the children of Israel before him were trying to rebuild the walls, trying to rebuild the gates, and they were stopped, and then they were destroyed again. And then Nehemiah comes later in 445 BC. A lot of numbers here, I'm sorry. Okay, and then in verse 24, he says, "Then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem stopped, and it caused or ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." So what? What? And so in verse 25, then we revert back to Darius. But Darius reigned before Artaxerxes, way before Artaxerxes. So what's going on here? So this is what's happening. Is that in verse 6 to verse 23 is kind of a parenthesis that is describing the opposition of these people. That these people did not have good intentions when they came to talk to Zerubbabel. It was always in order to oppose God's work. They did not like God's people. So this is just a parenthesis describing their opposition. This was something that happened much later. But then verse 24 reverts back to the situation that he was referring to in verses 1 to 5. So verse 24 reverts back to verse 5, where in verse 5 it says that they frustrated their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All right, the verse 24 picks that back up again and says, then the work on the house of God that is in Jerusalem ceased. And it ceased until when? The second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. And so things started picking back up again at the second year of the reign of King Darius of Persia. Woo! Okay. That's all I wanted to share with that. That's a kind of a long explanation. But what is our application from this? Or what is an application that we can get from this? Is that God's people, when they obey God's will, when they worship in God's way, when they try to live godly lives in this day and age, will face opposition, will face persecution, will face resistance from the people of this world. It will happen. It will. If the Apostle Paul says, if you want to live a godly life in this day and age, you will face persecution. It will happen. But the one thing that we can be reminded of in this is that God will always grant his seemingly defenseless community, his people, he will give them guidance, protection, and power during these times. He will give you guidance, protection, and power to live through it. That doesn't mean that God will lift that persecution. That doesn't mean God will lift that opposition. If you notice here, that opposition continued from King Cyrus's reign, which was around 539 BC. It was probably more like 586 BC when they finally got into the land to start building the temple, Jerusalem. 536 BC, all the way to the time of King Artaxerxes around 445 BC, 420 BC, 24 BC. That whole period of time, there was opposition to the work of God, to the building of the temple, to the worship of the Lord. There was opposition. It didn't stop. I am certain that the people of God, the children of Israel, were praying that God would relieve them of all this trouble and difficulty. And they were. And they were afraid and they were terrified. But God, it might not be God's will for that to occur. The Apostle Paul says, if you live a godly life, you will face persecution. It will happen. John 15, Jesus says, if they persecuted me, they'll persecute you. The slave or the servant is not above his master. So if it happens to the master, it will most definitely happen to the slave or servant. And so we can't present to you, young believer in Christ, we can't present to you this, everything is going to be sunshine and lollipops in your Christian walk. It won't. If you want to live for Jesus, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. But God is working through you and in you to make you the man and woman that he wants you to be. All right? And he's there. James says, count this all but joy when you fall into these various trials and difficulties. The Apostle Paul is an example to us that he went through so many difficulties and struggles and persecutions and beatings and storms and all these kinds of things. But he says all these things, and he even received personal thorn in the flesh, a servant of the enemy to pester him, persecute him. Why? Well, to be reminded that God's grace is sufficient in our weakness. And so we glory in our weakness, which is hard to do, isn't it? We glory in our weakness that God might be honored and glorified and exalted. When we have a mindset that this life is not about us, but this life is about God, it changes things. But God is with you. God is going to guide you. He's going to give you wisdom. He'll protect you as he sees fit. He'll give you the power to work through these things. That was my application for him. Ezra chapter 4. Encouraged to hear what you might have to say about Ezra chapter 4. Feel free to go on and to our Driven webpage and share a comment. Love to hear from you. All right, God bless, and we'll see you on Sunday.